One of the most common, the most ridiculous, the most dishonest beliefs of Austrian economics is that all states are socialism, an evil totalitarian structure. If the government exists, even the most tiny form, it is therefore a totalitarian state. I mean, I'm not making an exaggeration here. This is literally what people who believe in Austrian economics will yell to you online. They really believe that even the slightest regulation means you're living in an evil totalitarian state. This is one of the primary reasons why their economic beliefs aren't taken seriously in society, meaning academics, people in government, people in education don't take their ideas seriously. There's a reason for this. They don't correspond to reality, and this is just frankly a stupid assumption that all state, any regulation in any way, shape, or form is therefore the same thing as an evil totalitarian government. I mean, they literally do go to the lengths of complaining that a truck plowing the road, plowing snow in the winter is the state and is Nazism. Now, they have in this we see like their mentality that's ironically exactly the same as Nazis. Nazis have a preconceived belief that whites are superior, and they come up with all kinds of like horribly distorted studies which are usually very anti-scientific. They present them, and when the scientific community laughs at them or just ignores them completely given the unscientific basis of them, they exclaim, oh, that's because Jews control science, or they control that scientific community. Austrians do the same thing. When they come up with their ridiculous beliefs, unverified things, or perverted sense of scientific investigation, when they present it, and then actual economists, like actual people in the field, just completely ignore them or laugh at them, it becomes, you're all a bunch of statists, and because you're fascists, you don't want to listen or believe in what we have to say. It's exactly the same mentality. Just take the Nazi belief of, oh, it's all Jews, and replace it with, it's all statists, and you have exactly the same thing. The ridiculousness of their position is palpable. If something exists in its most smallest minute form, it also exists at the same time in its most exaggerated extreme form. It would be the same thing if I were to say, oh look, there's one American in the room, therefore all of the brown people in the room are going to be killed by him. They believe that all states are socialism. Now, there is a basis for believing this in Mises' writings. He does say that if you even have one slightest little bit of state, it's eventually going to turn into an evil totalitarian state, which means it's essentially just a slippery slope fallacy. But in Mises' arguing that all state is inherently bad, is contradicted by his own words where he says state intervention is actually good. But what did Mises actually say? Well, actually he says state intervention actually goes against economic law, and that it can only lead to one of two things, an evil totalitarian state or complete and utter total chaos. The funny thing is about this, without realizing it, he's actually arguing a dialectical position. He's essentially arguing quantity into quality, and that this will go on and eventually transform into either socialism or anarchism. So it's rather ironic that he actually has this whole thing. His belief in this is actually based on dialectical materialism, which he most certainly rejects. But here's how Mises defines government intervention. The intervention is a decree issued directly or indirectly by the authority in charge of society's administrative apparatus of coercion and compulsion, which forces the entrepreneurs and capitalists to employ some of the factors of production in a way different from what they would have resorted to if they were only obeying the dictates of the market. Such a decree can either be in order to do something or in order not to do something. It is not required that the decree be issued directly by the established and generally recognized authority itself. It may happen that some other agencies arrogate to themselves the power to issue such orders or prohibitions, and to enforce them by apparatus of violent coercion and oppression of their own. If the recognized government tolerates such procedures or even supports them by the employment of its governmental police apparatus, matters stand as if the government itself had acted. If the government is opposed to other agencies' violent action, but it does not succeed in suppressing it by means of its own armed forces, although it would likely to suppress it, anarchy results. Next, I will give Mises' clear view on interventionism. The supporters of the most recent variety of intervention, the German post-World War II social market economy in Germany, stress that they consider the market economy to be the best possible and most desirable system of society's economic organization, and that they are opposed to the government omnipotence of socialism. But of course, all these advocates of the middle-of-the-road policy emphasize with the same vigor that they reject the laissez-faire liberalism. All these champions of interventionism fail to realize that their program thus implies an establishment of full government supremacy in all economic matters and ultimately brings about a state of affairs that does not differ from what is called the German or Hindenburg pattern of socialism. If it is in the jurisdiction of the government to decide whether or not definite conditions of the economy justify its intervention, no sphere of operation is left to the market. Then it is no longer the consumers who ultimately determine what should be produced, in what quantity, of what quality, by whom, where, and how, but it is the government. For as soon as the outcome brought about by the operation of the unhampered market differs from what the authorities consider socially desirable, the government interferes. That means the market is free as long as it does precisely what the government wants it to do. It is free to do what the authorities consider to be the right things, but not to do what they consider the wrong things. The decision concerning what is right and what is wrong rests with the government. Thus, the doctrine and the practice of interventionism ultimately tend to abandon what originally distinguished them from outright socialism and to adopt entirely the principles of totalitarian all-around planning. In this passage, Mises is actually attacking the Keynesian World War II type policies that were put out at the end of the war. He's again starting from one of his presupposed axioms that all state interventionism is therefore totalitarianism. And because it's praxeological, nothing can refute him, not even reality itself. Rothbard and Schuller had an exchange over this, and this is the response that Schuller gave to Rothbard, pointing out fatal flaws in Mises. What does interventionist measures logically lead to mean? Either Mises believes that interventionism is cumulative and necessarily leads towards socialism and into chaos, another undefined term, or he does not. If he does, can he explain how Western nations reversed mercantilist intervention and established partially free markets in the 18th and 19th centuries, or how they accomplished partial decontrol after World Wars I and II? Can he explain how the purely free market is ever to be attained? On the other hand, if interventionism need not be cumulative, and Rothbard says it logically leads to the free market as well as to socialism, then it is necessarily incoherent, unstable, and transitory. If interventionism logically points in two opposite directions, toward zero and infinity, does it have to continue in either until it reaches, respectively, Elysium or chaos? Well, this is a good point. There was heavy interventionism in the mercantile markets of early Europe, 18th and 19th centuries, but at no point did this either lead to socialism or chaos. And in fact, what it really led to was a reorganization of trade along what closer to what it is that we have today. It did not lead to either one of those two outcomes predicted by Mises. Mises' idea here, when applied to the real world, and we're assuming that's what he intended it for, is met with countering empirical evidence. But this is never taken into account because praxeology. In addition to this, Mises outright contradicts himself in Human Action, where he says state intervention in the form of fire regulation is actually necessary and should be enforced. Economics neither approves nor disapproves of government measures restricting production and output. It merely considers its duty to clarify the consequences of such measures. The choice of policies to be adopted devolves upon the people, but in choosing, they must not disregard the teachings of economics if they want to attain the ends sought. There are certainly cases in which people may consider definite restrictive measures as justified. Regulations concerning fire prevention are restrictive and raise the cost of production, but the curtailment of total output they bring about is the price to be paid for avoidance of greater disaster. The decision about each restrictive measure is to be made on the ground of meticulous weighing of the costs to be incurred and the prize to be obtained. No reasonable man could possibly question this rule. Mises contradicts himself and says that there is room for intervention with this line: on the ground of a meticulous weighing of the cost to be incurred and the prize to be obtained. Some have argued that he meant this only on an individual basis by weighing essentially what his costs and benefits. But what he is saying is that there is a rule, which means he has just given us a system. No reasonable man could possibly question this rule. Now let's take his word on this. We assume that that would refer to him himself, that even he's not allowed to question the rule because he's a reasonable man. Now on top of that, he also gives this: choice of policies to be adopted devolves upon the people. This seems to indicate that he's arguing that a democratic mechanism could also apply these rules to society. Now Schuller once again points out a flaw in Mises' reasoning. If all intervention is irrational, then how can Mises sanction it for defense of the citizen against violent invasion of his person and property? Mises says the decision about each restrictive measure is to be made on the ground of meticulous weighing of the cost to be incurred and the prize to be obtained. In fire regulations, the prize outweighs the cost. Thus, he admits that the government interference in the private markets for armaments, mercenary soldiers, non-fireproofed buildings, or burglar's equipment can attain the end sought and need not lead to socialism. Once Mises grants the distinction between intelligent and unintelligent intervention, and even the need for former to preserve a partly free market economy, Mises leaves his sectarian utopia and joins the rest of us in choosing among imperfect but possible alternatives in the real world. Here Mises clearly states that government intervention in the form of fire regulations is necessary, and in fact says that it's necessary to go ahead and use force against private property to enforce this. He's literally going against the market in a limited form in order to support government intervention on private property to maintain a safety regulation. In Human Action, Mises says that intervention is unacceptable and will lead to chaos or socialism. And then he leaves the door open for intelligent, rational intervention in order to help the economy. And then not only that, he leaves it open for a democratic mechanism for installing it, basically. In order for interventionism to exist, and for there to be a democratic mechanism for it, government must also therefore exist. On these grounds, you could construct a rational case for just about anything. The entire Keynesian model can be argued in this matter. Regulation on drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, tobacco, firearms, just about anything in the economy, safety regulations, environmental protection, all these things can be argued on these grounds, a door which Mises has deliberately left open for people to use. Notice how at no point does Mises actually show how allowing even the slightest government regulation will lead to socialism. He instead just says that if you allow the slightest bit, it will turn into totalitarianism. This is called a slippery slope fallacy. Mises isn't making an academic argument against state intervention here. He's basically just making a very lofty and inherently contradictory moral argument against it. Are we making the argument that Mises was a socialist or that he was a collectivist in some way? No, of course not. He stands for the individual, yet like all economists, he seems to understand that some state intervention into things is necessary. And not only did he support it in a few cases happening, he supported there be a democratic mechanism so that people could choose to have it. This seems to run entirely opposite to what people who follow Austrian economics believe, or what people who even follow Mises believe. Mises completely contradicts himself. He literally advocates two completely opposite things. Yet we can't call him on it because praxeology. Thank you for watching. Please comment and rate the video. If you liked it, hit subscribe or check out some of these other great videos. If you wish, share it on social media. While you're at it, why don't you follow me on Twitter? And if you got time, go on over to the MRN bookstore and check out some of the latest books available.